let's start with Anne. Why don't you tell us your background and how you got into crypto?
Absolutely. So I've always had a passion for impact and trying to change the world, as cheesy as that might be. In my younger days, I did that through international NGOs. So I actually worked with Doctors Without Borders in Central African Republic and in DR Congo. And the place that I was working was one of the most remote places I will ever be in my entire life. There was no internet, no electricity, no water. And so we had a staff of about 200 people working for us. And when we had to pay them at the end of the month, of course, they're unbanked, and we had to pay them in cash. So if you think about how you get the money to pay 200 people, the cash, from the capital city to one of the most remote places on Earth, it's an interesting challenge. So I actually used to carry knapsacks full of cash on my back through military checkpoints, through guerrilla-run territory, and then we'd store it in our office. And so I've had many colleagues who have been robbed, they've been kidnapped, they've been injured as a result of doing this work. And so for me, when I heard about Bitcoin in 2012, the aha moment I had was thinking, okay, if we could just pay all of our staff with the click of a mouse from Europe, all of this work that we were doing to count the cash and put it out would be so much more efficient. But fundamentally, it wasn't about efficiency. It was about the lives of the people that I was working with who would be saved by not carrying cash in highly insecure countries.
And actually, just to continue, so then how did you end up working in this space, and what do you do now?
Yeah, so I focus very much on projects at the intersection of blockchain and social impact. So I teach with Singularity University, and then I'm advising a really exciting company out of Toronto called Buns. That's the online trading and bartering platform. They've been able to keep more than it's the equivalent of 2 blue whales of trash out of the garbage by using cryptocurrency to facilitate trades between people in their community. So working in that space and working with a couple of NGOs as well.
Oh, very cool. Okay, Cara.
Great. So I came to the blockchain world through the lens of ethics and technology. So my technical background is actually in autonomous systems. I spent over 2 decades in the US Navy, and I was working on autonomous systems, military autonomous systems. As you can imagine, there are some ethical debates around that, so I got heavily involved in some of those discussions. And so that's what brought me to Georgetown University about 1.5 years ago, where they asked me to come over and start to look at some similar issues around blockchain and how it was being deployed in terms of social impact, to look at the privacy and ethical implications of that. So that has resulted in, we actually launched earlier this summer something called a blockchain ethical design framework. So it really is a methodology and a tool that people can use to have a thoughtful and ethical design process when they're developing blockchain technologies for social impact.
So we've been talking about blockchain kind of more in terms of like the investment aspect, the speculative aspect, but everybody also talks about how blockchain technology can be used for social good. What are some of the more promising applications in that regard?
I think Alex really nailed it yesterday when he talked about how it's really about freedom. It's about freedom of choice, freedom of expression, freedom of financial system. Because when you think about all these countries that Bill was talking about as well, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, if you make money on Monday and it doesn't buy you anything on Friday, there's a word for that, and it's slavery, right? It's really fundamentally, if you don't have the option to take the money that you earn and put it in something that will actually store its value, you're not a worker, you are a slave. And so when you see this opportunity for people to choose the financial system that they want, whether it is their national currency or whether it's Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency, that really is freedom. And so I think, first and foremost, that's where I see the absolute benefit. But then beyond, when you look at decentralization and a lot of the other examples out there, the options for social good just expand into virtually every single industry that we see in the world.
And I think it goes beyond just the financial applications, right? Blockchain, first of all, let's level set that blockchain is not one thing, right? There's a lot of different ways to create blockchain technologies, and they have very different impacts on people's lives. But the other kinds of things that people are using blockchain for, to create digital identity systems, to do asset tracking, now those assets could be mobile voting systems. Those assets could be if you donate to a charity and being able to actually track where your dollars are going through the charity. looking at organic produce. When you go to the grocery store, you see the organic apples and the other apples. How do you really know that those are organic? Well, if there was a provenance tracking system through a blockchain, you'd be a lot more sure of where it was coming from. So there's a whole range of different applications of blockchain in the social impact space.
Yeah, I don't know if any of you lived in New York, but maybe about 10 years ago or so, after I'd moved away, I realized that, or there was a news article saying that this one grocer called Healthy Pleasures had been labeling non-organic produce as organic, and I did like all my grocery shopping there when I lived in New York, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. But anyway, so I actually want to go back to identity. What are some of the problems with identity that need to be solved, and how can blockchain technology solve them?
Yeah, so identity, I think, is a really interesting application of blockchain. There's over 1 billion people in the world that don't have any kind of formal identity. Think about that. Think about any time you try to access any service in your life, whether it's healthcare, financial services, trying to cross a border. What is the first thing somebody asks you for? Your identity, right? So if you can use blockchain to start to create secure digital identities, that is really powerful. Right? I mean, think about even closer to home, homeless populations. People are looking at how can you create a digital identity system for homeless populations so that when they can't keep track of some kind of paper identification, they can show up somewhere and have their biometrics linked to an identity system, and then that can better access services for them.
There's an interesting angle too around the privacy of identity. So if you think about the last time you went out to a bar, not counting last night, which was a lot of fun. And the bouncer says, okay, I need to see your ID so you can get in. And you hand over your ID, or maybe your daughter does, whatever it is. And the only information they really need to know is that you're over 18 or over 21. But when you hand them your driver's license, they know your name, they know your birthday, they know your address, they have significant amounts of information that could help them actually steal your identity and maybe take out a credit card, or in a worst case scenario, they could actually follow you home at the end of the night. So if you think about blockchain-based ID, where you could put your fingerprint in your phone and it would just turn green and say, yep, she's over 21. You don't need to know her birthday, you don't need to know her name, but you can let her in your bar. It's verified.
Yeah, I actually also wanted to mention something that came up in one of my podcasts. I interviewed Catherine Hahn, who is a former federal prosecutor, and that's what her job was at the time. Now she's one of the GPs at Andreessen Horowitz and co-manages their crypto fund. But she talked on my podcast about how apparently in the US, there's 14,000 legitimate versions of birth certificates out there, literally. And so she was saying that this leads to what's called breeder documents, where basically with some kind of faked birth certificate, which would be really difficult for anybody to figure out was fake, you can create then like a passport and a driver's license and all these really useful identities that you can use to do all kinds of things. So I think that's definitely another area, kind of combating fraud. But let's kind of also talk about the provenance issue that you mentioned earlier. I feel like there's so many areas where that can be applied. What are some examples, and what are the problems that can solve there?
Yeah, I mean, there are myriad examples. We talked a bit about secure mobile voting, but think about the government applications also in terms of deeds and land registry, right? There's a lot of countries around the world that are exploring. If they could put land registries on a blockchain, then think about how much you pay for title insurance when you buy a house. Right? But there's always some challenges with this, right? There's what we call the zero state problem. How does everybody decide that the initial information that goes into the blockchain is a ground truth to start with, right? But there are other things, like think about after a disaster, trying to keep track of all of the resources and all of the needs and all of the resources that go into a disaster zone. That's an area where you have a lot of different people who have to access the system, have to write to the system, have to see the system. These are the areas that people are exploring for blockchain to see how you can track things, especially in these very decentralized environments.
It's also coming to play. There's a few companies looking at provenance in terms of elimination of slavery in the fishing trade. So you could track your fish back to a company that does proper fishing. There's other ones that are looking at diamond tracing so that you can be sure the diamond you purchased was not a blood diamond. So when you really think about it, I mean, yes, it's a supply chain problem, but at the end of the day, the real problem it is solving are very critical issues around human rights and climate change and these sorts of things.
Yeah, climate change is actually where I wanted to go next. So I am curious to know, like, how do you think it can be applied in that regard to try to solve this massive problem we're facing?
One of the biggest ways, I think, first and foremost, is in the carbon trading market. I had met with someone who worked in that industry, and she basically said that when you're trading carbon credits, there's actually one individual in Scotland who sits there with an Excel spreadsheet and says, oh, okay, these people want to trade with these people, and then puts it in there, which is ridiculous. So if you can start to put these tokens on publicly tradable markets, so you're not dependent on one centralized body to actually be moving them around, you can have some massive impacts there.
I think another way is in microgrids for solar. There have been some really interesting examples here in the US, in Brooklyn and other places where people put solar panels and they actually created local trading markets themselves through a blockchain. But also internationally, I think we've looked at a couple examples throughout the conference of, you can have solar and people can pay as you go. There's a new company, Bitlumens, who's working on this, and a number of other companies where you can put solar places where people can't afford that capital investment, but then they pay incrementally to actually use that equipment.
I had actually was talking with someone yesterday about the concept of sticking solar cells in the middle of nowhere in these deserts and the Sahara and that kind of thing, and hooking them up to Bitcoin mining rigs. So the energy consumption issue is not so much of a problem, and you don't need to move the energy because they're just running the rigs right there.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. So obviously, we've been talking really pie in the sky. It sounds like, oh, blockchain technology, it's going to solve all these things. But kind of as I alluded to earlier in my speech, people often have really well-intentioned plans. They don't always come off that way. So what do you think are kind of the potential pitfalls, or how do you think some of these plans could go awry?
Well, technology is a tool, right? And it's never a panacea. And technology can do incredible things, but there's always a flip side, right? When you develop technology for a purpose, there's often unintended consequences of that technology. There's also people out there who are eager to subvert that technology for their own uses, right? So the more thoughtful you can be about some of these things at the beginning in your design process is better. But think about digital identity systems. You're putting people's potentially personal information into a system that is distributed, transparent, immutable. Think back to that example I said about in terms of homeless populations, creating digital identity. Well, I'm a veteran. I was in the military for a long time. Let's say you had a homeless veteran and somebody accidentally put into the system that they were dishonorably discharged from the military. That means they would be cut out from all of their military benefits if that was the system that was used to connect them to benefits, right? So, mistakes happen. People are human. So you have to think through these things at the beginning. How do you start to create systems where you can make corrections in a system? And, you understand with blockchain, you can never erase a transaction. You can create another transaction that reverses that original transaction. But that information will always be there, and it can be potentially very damaging to folks depending on how it's entered in.
I think one of the issues I also see in the blockchain space is people have such good intentions and they're so excited about the technology that they're trying to apply it anywhere they can. And they either don't have the knowledge of the underlying problem, or the blockchain solution that they apply, which technically is feasible, doesn't actually solve the problem that needs to be solved. So I see this a lot in the case of projects working in the African continent, in developing countries. There was one project that was specifically related to banking unbanked African women using this particular token. And when I asked them how these unbanked African women would get the token, they said, oh, well, they can buy it with Bitcoin. So well, how are they going to get Bitcoin? There's 2 ATMs on the continent at the time, and so they hadn't really thought through the realities of the actual problem space, and we're just trying to apply blockchain to it without really a whole lot of thought.
So I know you've been working on this ethical framework for blockchain. What are some tips that you would have for people that want to use blockchain technology and apply it in these different ways to have a positive social impact?
Well, I think the first thing is make sure you understand the problem that you're trying to solve and understand the entire ecosystem around that problem and the outcome you're trying to achieve. And bring in a really diverse set of voices and stakeholders as you're thinking through this. Because if you are surrounded by people who have the same paradigm as you do, you're going to approach this problem in one way. But as Anna was alluding to, if you don't think through what is the infrastructure that this system is going in, what's the technology infrastructure, what's the regulatory and legal infrastructure, but then who are the users? What are the user dynamics? You may go into a place and say, okay, I'm going to use a blockchain to help distribute aid, and the unit I'm going to distribute aid to is going to be the family unit. Okay, so there's an adult and there's children. Well, there's places in the world where family units are not led by an adult. So if that's the way you design your system, that's not going to work, right? And it really comes down to governance. Blockchain is a system where you set up, you create a set of rules, and all the transactions have to follow those rules. So there is a lot of power in creating those rules about who has access, who controls and owns data and transactions and assets. So being very diverse from the very beginning and really understanding the ecosystem of the problem that you're trying to solve, I think is the good first step.
Yeah, I would also say don't forget history, because I've seen a lot of projects out there that, again, are very well intentioned, but are repeating a lot of the mistakes of the past. There's one in Puerto Rico right now where they're trying to create a decentralized community, and they're effectively recolonizing Puerto Rico. And so you have to be very careful about not just having good intentions, but actually having good operations and a good strategy behind what you're doing to actually achieve the outcomes you want to achieve.
So we actually have a few minutes left for questions. Are there any questions in the audience? I think we've got some mics in the back. Nobody wants to do a social impact project with blockchain.
Everybody wants to go for lunch. That's what they want.
Yeah, I guess so.
I think there's one in the back.
Okay, yeah, let's go with that.
Hi. Hi, Anne, as well. So I'm curious, because you've been at the interface of this technology and now working with some of the traditional development organizations. What's your observation on their willingness to use this technology for transformation?
So it's been a slow road. I launched one of the world's first Bitcoin donation programs in 2014. I had tried to do it in 2013. And that was a slow process. And even still working with NGOs today, there's a huge education gap. They're typically less innovative than the traditional world, much less innovative than the folks in the audience now. And so you really have to go slow, start with education, start with the smallest pilot project you possibly can, because otherwise, for them, looking at innovative or not guaranteed outcomes and with new projects. So if you've got something, you're like, okay, we're going to try this new blockchain thing. It might fail, it might succeed. To them, they say, okay, well, if we try this and it fails, there's lives at stake, or there's outcomes we're not going to hit. And so we'd rather stick with this one that's 100% guaranteed to give you 80% results versus this one that would be much better but is more likely to fail. And so my real strategy around it is looking at what is the easiest entry point that we can get them into, which typically for a lot of organizations, from my perspective, is charity fundraising. Get them accustomed to how the money moves, how the crypto moves, how they can exchange it, get them to use it, and then start to talk about some of the greater benefits around decentralization and how they can use blockchain in a more infrastructure-style implementation.
Hi, this is Jeff DeRose from Deloitte. I wanted to get your opinion on the application near term for blockchain to support micro-lending.
Micro-lending?
Micro-lending, is that what you asked? Yeah, so financial inclusion is one of the amazing potentials of blockchain. And so I think a lot of people are working in that space and developing proof of concepts right now. And so that's one of the things we hear a lot about. Now, once again, how you set up that system is really important, and understanding the ecosystem that you're walking into, and it's very contextual in terms of the different societies. But I think it's a really powerful application of blockchain.
I think also there's a lot of appetite for, instead of micro-lending, just cash transfers. So Brian Armstrong of Coinbase launched an organization called Give Crypto about 2-3 weeks ago. And essentially the whole concept is trying to build a crypto endowment fund that will then send cash transfers around the world. And I know WFP, the World Food Program, also has a really successful pilot that they've done using cash transfers, where typically when you see famine in places, it's not that there's a lack of food, it's actually that there's a lack of money to buy food. And so they've, in the past, had been giving people food, subsequently flooding the market with a whole bunch of food that wasn't required. And so that would create more cycles of poverty and famine. And so what they've done is move to a system of cash transfers, but when you're actually giving money to people, the infrastructure to do that is difficult, and you don't really know what they're spending the money on. So they've moved to a crypto token model where they can give them these tokens that can be spent at local grocery stores and local shops, and then they'll only do the effects transfer with the grocery stores, meaning that instead of having to do cash transfers with, say, 100,000 people, they only have to do it with 400 stores. And so they've done this in Pakistan as well as in Jordan with a number of Syrian refugees, and they are poised to save like millions of dollars. I can't remember exactly how many, but it's been a very successful program, and a great example of a simple implementation that just has efficiency gains that will then free up more money to actually go to the people who need it.
Yeah.
There's another interesting associated application in terms of aggregation of microassets. Right? I mean, there's a lot of places in the world where people don't have enough assets to actually be interesting to the formal financial markets, but using blockchain-based systems, you can start to aggregate those assets, and then they can enter into a more formal system.
Yeah, and if you're interested in learning more about that UN World Food Program pilot, I had the head of that program on my podcast, Unconfirmed. His name is Robert Opp, and he spoke about it, and he did, I think, mention dollar figure in terms of savings, but I also don't remember it. This was back in May. Cara and I met him, actually, at the same conference. But yeah, he talked about how it was hugely successful, and I think he hinted that basically the UN is interested in maybe adopting it in other areas because it actually has been really, really useful. And oh, there's one back there.
Yeah, great to see an all-female panel at this point in the conference. And you guys gave some great examples of the social impact layer of projects in the developing world, energy, identity, food. Having already done lots of research, can you just throw some more examples out? Because I'm really curious. And
I think one of my favorite companies that's out there is one out of Vancouver, Canada called RightMesh. And they're essentially mixing blockchain and mesh networks. So if you can imagine you've got a developing country or somewhere that doesn't have internet access, if you have one person that has internet access, perhaps through their phone or through their home, they can then connect to everybody else in the town. And so using blockchain, anyone who's processing sort of that transfer of information back to the internet will get paid a little bit, a little microtransaction in cryptocurrency, and then everyone in the town has access to the internet even though only one person actually has that connection. So that's a really exciting project that fundamentally is going to open up access to information and access to this freedom of crypto and that type of thing for populations all around the world.
So having a largely ocean background, one of the ones that's really exciting to me is not just looking at the seafood industry from the slavery perspective, but also in terms of illegal fishing and how you can start to use a suite of technologies where blockchain is one, but also using visual image processing and AI and other technologies and satellite technology to really be able to track where catch and how much catch is being taken, especially across the Pacific Ocean and other places, and to record that automatically into a blockchain system. I think that's a really powerful application.
Great examples. RightMesh is awesome. They raise money. They've got a great team. What about carbon sinks and projects where, I guess, contributing to climate change, where there's perhaps corrupt government, and how do we empower people to save their forests, their jungles? Have you come across anything around that?
There's a number of different companies working on the climate change angle. Where it gets really interesting is when you start to integrate blockchain with sensors. So if you said perhaps, okay, we want to reforest this whole area, we'll use NASA satellite data to identify whether or not that impact has been achieved, and then that will trigger the payment through blockchain. Now, naysayers will say the only thing that's going to do is going to create a price uptick in green paint, so they'll paint the ground instead of planting the trees, but there's one of the possible outcomes. But there's some really neat things that you can do as well with adding sensors to farmland to make sure that it's being farmed in a sustainable way. Essentially looking at how can you actually take data from unique sources and then use that to trigger payments or to trigger tokenization of data that can then be sold and traded.
Great. Well, these have been fantastic questions. Thank you guys for your wonderful answers. We are out of time, but this has been really fabulous.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.